Part 3 of Sophist by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Stranger. Let us inquire then how we come to predicate many names of the same thing. Theaetetus. Give an example. Stranger. I mean that we speak of man, for example, under many names, that we attribute to him colors and forms and magnitudes and virtues and vices, in all of which instances, and in 10,000 others, we not only speak of him as a man, but also as good, and having numberless other attributes, and in the same way anything else which we originally supposed to be one is described by us as many, and under many names. Theaetetus. That is true. Stranger. And thus we provide a rich feast for tyros, whether young or old, for there is nothing easier than to argue that the one cannot be many, or the many one. And great is their delight in denying that a man is good, for man, they insist, is man, and good is good. I dare say that you have met with persons who take an interest in such matters. They are often elderly men, whose meagre sense is thrown into amazement by these discoveries of theirs, which they believe to be the height of wisdom. Theaetetus. Certainly I have. Stranger. Then, not to exclude any one who has ever speculated at all upon the nature of being, let us put our questions to them as well as to our former friends. Theaetetus. What questions? Stranger. Shall we refuse to attribute being to motion and rest, or anything to anything, and assume that they do not mingle and are incapable of participating in one another? Or shall we gather all into one class of things communicable with one another? Or are some things communicable and others not? Which of these alternatives, Theaetetus, will they prefer? Theaetetus. I have nothing to answer on their behalf. Suppose that you take all these hypotheses in turn, and see what are the consequences which follow from each of them. Stranger. Very good. And first let us assume them to say that nothing is capable of participating in anything else in any respect. In that case, rest and motion cannot participate in being at all. Theaetetus. They cannot. Stranger. But would either of them be, if not participating in being? Theaetetus. No. Stranger. Then by this admission everything is instantly overturned, as well the doctrine of universal motion as of universal rest, and also the doctrine of those who distribute being into immutable and everlasting kinds, for all these add on a notion of being, some affirming that things are truly in motion, and others that they are truly at rest. Theaetetus. Just so. Stranger. Again, those who would at one time compound, and at another resolve all things, whether making them into one, and out of one creating infinity, or dividing them into finite elements, and forming compounds out of these, whether they suppose the processes of creation to be successive or continuous, would be talking nonsense in all this if there were no admixture. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. Most ridiculous of all will the men themselves be who want to carry out the argument, and yet forbid us to call anything, because participating in some affection from another, by the name of that other. Theaetetus. Why so? Stranger. Why, because they are compelled to use the words to be, apart, from others, in itself, and 10,000 more, which they cannot give up, but must make the connecting links of discourse, and therefore they do not require to be refuted by others, but their enemy, as the saying is, inhabits the same house with them. They are always carrying about with them an adversary, like the wonderful ventriloquist Eurycles, who out of their own bellies audibly contradicts them. Theaetetus. Precisely so. A very true and exact illustration. Stranger. And now, if we suppose that all things have the power of communion with one another, what will follow? Theaetetus. Even I can solve that riddle. Stranger. How? Theaetetus. Why, because motion itself would be at rest, and rest again in motion, if they could be attributed to one another. Stranger. But this is utterly impossible. Theaetetus. Of course. Stranger. Then only the third hypothesis remains. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. For surely either all things have communion with all, or nothing with any other thing, or some things communicate with some things, and others not. Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. And two out of these three suppositions have been found to be impossible? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. Every one, then, who desires to answer truly will adopt the third and remaining hypothesis of the communion of some with some. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. This communion of some with some may be illustrated by the case of letters, for some letters do not fit each other, while others do. Theaetetus. Of course. Stranger. And the vowels especially are a sort of bond which pervades all the other letters, so that without a vowel one consonant cannot be joined to another? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. But does every one know what letters will unite with what? Or is art required in order to do so? Theaetetus. Art is required. Stranger. What art? Theaetetus. The art of grammar. Stranger. And is not this also true of sounds high and low? Is not he who has the art to know what sounds mingle a musician, and he who is ignorant not a musician? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And we shall find this to be generally true of art or the absence of art? Theaetetus. Of course. Stranger. And as classes are admitted by us in like manner to be some of them capable and others incapable of intermixture, must not he who would rightly show what kinds will unite and what will not proceed by the help of science in the path of argument? And will he not ask if the connecting links are universal, and so capable of intermixture with all things, and again in divisions, whether there are not other universal classes which make them possible? Theaetetus. To be sure he will require science, and, if I am not mistaken, the very greatest of all sciences. Stranger. How are we to call it? By Zeus, have we not lighted unwittingly upon our free and noble science? And in looking for the sophist, have we not entertained the philosopher unawares? Theaetetus. What do you mean? Stranger. Should we not say that the division according to classes, which neither makes the same other, nor makes other the same, is the business of the dialectical science? Theaetetus. That is what we should say. Stranger. Then, surely, he who can divide rightly is able to see clearly one form pervading a scattered multitude, and many different forms contained under one higher form, and again one form knit together into a single whole and pervading many such wholes, and many forms existing only in separation and isolation. This is the knowledge of classes which determines where they can have communion with one another, and where not. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. And the art of dialectic would be attributed by you only to the philosopher pure and true? Theaetetus. Who but he can be worthy? Stranger. In this region we shall always discover the philosopher if we look for him. Like the sophist, he is not easily discovered, but for a different reason. Theaetetus. For what reason? Stranger. Because the sophist runs away into the darkness of not being, in which he has learned by habit to feel about, and cannot be discovered because of the darkness of the place. Is not that true? Theaetetus. It seems to be so. Stranger. And the philosopher, always holding converse through reason with the idea of being, is also dark from excess of light, for the souls of the many have no eye which can endure the vision of the divine. Theaetetus. Yes, that seems to be quite as true as the other. Stranger. Well, the philosopher may hereafter be more fully considered by us, if we are disposed, but the sophist must clearly not be allowed to escape until we have had a good look at him. Theaetetus. Very good. Stranger. Since then we are agreed that some classes have a communion with one another, and others not, and some have communion with a few, and others with many, and that there is no reason why some should not have universal communion with all, let us now pursue the enquiry, as the argument suggests, not in relation to all ideas, lest the multitude of them should confuse us, but let us select a few of those which are reckoned to be the principal ones, and consider their several natures, and their capacity of communion with one another, in order that if we are not able to apprehend with perfect clearness the notions of being and not being, we may at least not fall short in the consideration of them, so far as they come within the scope of the present enquiry, if peradventure we may be allowed to assert the reality of not being, and yet escape unscathed. Theaetetus. We must do so. Stranger. The most important of all the genera are those which we were just now mentioning, being, and rest, and motion. Theaetetus. Yes, by far. Stranger. And two of these are, as we affirm, incapable of communion with one another. Theaetetus. Quite incapable. Stranger. Whereas being surely has communion with both of them, for both of them are. Theaetetus. Of course. Stranger. That makes up three of them. Theaetetus. To be sure. Stranger. And each of them is other than the remaining two, but the same with itself? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. But then, what is the meaning of these two words, same and other? Are they two new kinds other than the three, and yet always of necessity intermingling with them? And are we to have 5 kinds instead of 3? Or when we speak of the same and other, are we unconsciously speaking of one of the 3 first kinds? Theaetetus. Very likely we are. Stranger. But surely motion and rest are neither the other nor the same? Theaetetus. How is that? Stranger. Whatever we attribute to motion and rest in common cannot be either of them? Theaetetus. Why not? Stranger. Because motion would be at rest, and rest in motion, for either of them, being predicated of both, will compel the other to change into the opposite of its own nature, because partaking of its opposite. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. Yet they surely both partake of the same and of the other? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. Then we must not assert that motion, any more than rest, is either the same or the other. Theaetetus. No, we must not. Stranger. But are we to conceive that being and the same are identical? Theaetetus. Possibly. Stranger. But if they are identical, then again in saying that motion and rest have being, we should also be saying that they are the same. Theaetetus. Which surely cannot be. Stranger. Then being and the same cannot be one? Theaetetus. Scarcely. Stranger. Then we may suppose the same to be a 4th class, which is now to be added to the 3 others. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. And shall we call the other a 5th class? Or should we consider being and other to be 2 names of the same class? Theaetetus. Very likely. Stranger. But you would agree, if I am not mistaken, that existences are relative as well as absolute? Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. And the other is always relative to other? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. But this would not be the case unless being and the other entirely differed. For if the other, like being, were absolute as well as relative, then there would have been a kind of other which was not other than other. And now we find that what is other must of necessity be what it is in relation to some other. Theaetetus. That is the true state of the case. Stranger. Then we must admit the other as the 5th of our selected classes. Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And the 5th class pervades all classes, for they all differ from one another, not by reason of their own nature, but because they partake of the idea of the other. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. Then Let us now put the case with reference to each of the five. Theaetetus. How? Stranger. First there is motion, which we affirm to be absolutely other than rest. What else can we say? Theaetetus. It is so. Stranger. And therefore is not rest. Theaetetus. Certainly not. Stranger. And yet is, because partaking of being? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. Again, motion is other than the same? Theaetetus. Just so. Stranger. And is therefore not the same? Theaetetus. It is not. Stranger. Yet surely motion is the same, because all things partake of the same? Theaetetus. Very true. Stranger. Then we must admit, and not object to say, that motion is the same, and is not the same, for we do not apply the terms same and not the same in the same sense, but we call it the same in relation to itself, because partaking of the same, and not the same, because having communion with the other, it is thereby severed from the same, and has become not that but other, and is therefore rightly spoken of as not the same. Theaetetus. To be sure. Stranger. And if absolute motion in any point of view partook of rest, there would be no absurdity in calling motion stationary? Theaetetus. Quite right. That is, on the supposition that some classes mingle with one another, and others not. Stranger. That such a communion of kinds is according to nature we had already proved before we arrived at this part of our discussion. Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. Let us proceed then. May we not say that motion is other than the other, having been also proved by us to be other than the same, and other than rest? Theaetetus. That is certain. Stranger. Then, according to this view, motion is other and also not other? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. What is the next step? Shall we say that motion is other than the three, and not other than the fourth? For we agreed that there are five classes, about and in the sphere of which we propose to make inquiry. Theaetetus. Surely we cannot admit that the number is less than it appeared to be just now. Stranger. Then we may without fear contend that motion is other than being? Theaetetus. Without the least fear. Stranger. The plain result is that motion, since it partakes of being, really is, and also is not? Theaetetus. Nothing can be plainer. Stranger. Then not being necessarily exists in the case of motion and of every class, for the nature of the other entering into them all makes each of them other than being, and so non-existent, and therefore of all of them, in like manner, we may truly say that they are not, and again, inasmuch as they partake of being, that they are and are existent. Theaetetus. So we may assume. Stranger. Every class then has plurality of being and infinity of not being? Theaetetus. So we must infer. Stranger. And being itself may be said to be other than the other kinds? Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. Then we may infer that being is not in respect of as many other things as there are, for not being these, it is itself one, and is not the other things, which are infinite in number. Theaetetus. That is not far from the truth. Stranger. And we must not quarrel with this result, since it is of the nature of classes to have communion with one another, and if any one denies our present statement, viz., that being is not, etc., let him first argue with our former conclusion, i.e., respecting the communion of ideas, and then he may proceed to argue with what follows. Theaetetus. Nothing can be fairer. Stranger. Let me ask you to consider a further question. Theaetetus. What question? Stranger. When we speak of not being, we speak, I suppose, not of something opposed to being, but only different? Theaetetus. What do you mean? Stranger. When we speak of something as not great, does the expression seem to you to imply what is little any more than what is equal? Theaetetus. Certainly not. Stranger. The negative particles ou and me, when prefixed to words, do not imply opposition, but only difference from the words, or more correctly, from the things represented by the words, which follow them. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. There is another point to be considered, if you do not object. Theaetetus. What is it? Stranger. The nature of the other appears to me to be divided into fractions like knowledge. Theaetetus. How so? Stranger. Knowledge, like the other, is one, and yet the various parts of knowledge have each of them their own particular name, and hence there are many arts and kinds of knowledge. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. And is not the case the same with the parts of the other, which is also one? Theaetetus. Very likely. But will you tell me how? Stranger. There is some part of the other which is opposed to the beautiful? Theaetetus. There is. Stranger. Shall we say that this has or has not a name? Theaetetus. It has. For whatever we call not beautiful is other than the beautiful, not than something else. Stranger. And now tell me another thing. Theaetetus. What? Stranger. Is the not beautiful anything but this, an existence parted off from a certain kind of existence, and again, from another point of view, opposed to an existing something? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. Then the not beautiful turns out to be the opposition of being to being? Theaetetus. Very true. Stranger. But upon this view, is the beautiful a more real, and the not beautiful a less real existence? Theaetetus. Not at all. Stranger. And the not great may be said to exist equally with the great? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And in the same way the just must be placed in the same category with the not just? The one cannot be said to have any more existence than the other? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. The same may be said of other things, seeing that the nature of the other has a real existence. The parts of this nature must equally be supposed to exist. Theaetetus. Of course. Stranger. Then, as would appear, the opposition of a part of the other and of a part of being to one another is, if I may venture to say so, as truly essence as being itself, and implies not the opposite of being, but only what is other than being. Theaetetus. Beyond question. Stranger. What then shall we call it? Theaetetus. Clearly, not being. And this is the very nature for which the sophist compelled us to search. Stranger. And has not this, as you were saying, as real an existence as any other class? May I not say with confidence that not being has an assured existence and a nature of its own? Just as the great was found to be great, and the beautiful beautiful, and the not great, and the not beautiful, in the same manner, not being has been found to be, and is not being, and is to be reckoned one among the many classes of being. Do you, Theaetetus, still feel any doubt of this? Theaetetus. None whatever. Stranger. Do you observe that our skepticism has carried us beyond the range of Parmenides' prohibition? Theaetetus. In what? Stranger. We have advanced to a further point, and shown him more than he forbade us to investigate. Theaetetus. How is that? Stranger. Why, because he says, not being never is, and do thou keep thy thoughts from this way of enquiry. Theaetetus. Yes, he says so. Stranger. Whereas we have not only proved that things which are not are, but we have shown what form of being not being is. For we have shown that the nature of the other is, and is distributed over all things in their relations to one another, and whatever part of the other is contrasted with being, this is precisely what we have ventured to call not being. Theaetetus. And surely, stranger, we were quite right. Stranger. Let not any one say then, that while affirming the opposition of not being to being, we still assert the being of not being. For as to whether there is an opposite of being, to that enquiry we have long said good-bye. It may or may not be, and may or may not be capable of definition. But as touching our present account of not being, let a man either convince us of error, or so long as he cannot, he too must say, as we are saying, that there is a communion of classes, and that being and difference or other traverse all things and mutually interpenetrate, so that the other partakes of being, and by reason of this participation is, and yet is not that of which it partakes, but other, and, being other than being, it is clearly a necessity that not being should be. And again, being, though partaking of the other, becomes a class other than the remaining classes, and being other than all of them is not each one of them, and is not all the rest, so that undoubtedly there are thousands upon thousands of cases in which being is not, and all other things, whether regarded individually or collectively, in many respects are, and in many respects are not. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And he who is skeptical of this contradiction must think how he can find something better to say, or if he sees a puzzle, and his pleasure is to drag words this way and that, the argument will prove to him that he is not making a worthy use of his faculties. For there is no charm in such puzzles, and there is no difficulty in detecting them. But we can tell him of something else, the pursuit of which is noble and also difficult. Theaetetus. What is it? Stranger. A thing of which I have already spoken. Letting alone these puzzles as involving no difficulty, he should be able to follow and criticize in detail every argument, and when a man says that the same is in a manner other, or that other is the same, to understand and refute him from his own point of view, and in the same respect in which he asserts either of these affections. But to show that somehow and in some sense the same is other, or the other same, or the great small, or the like unlike, and to delight in always bringing forward such contradictions, is no real refutation, but is clearly the new-born babe of some one who is only beginning to approach the problem of being. Theaetetus. To be sure. Stranger. For certainly, my friend, the attempt to separate all existences from one another is a barbarism, and utterly unworthy of an educated or philosophical mind. Theaetetus. Why so? Stranger. The attempt at universal separation is the final annihilation of all reasoning, for only by the union of conceptions with one another do we attain to discourse of reason. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And observe that we were only just in time in making a resistance to such separatists, and compelling them to admit that one thing mingles with another. Theaetetus. Why so? Stranger. Why, that we might be able to assert discourse to be a kind of being, for if we could not, the worst of all consequences would follow. We should have no philosophy. Moreover, the necessity for determining the nature of discourse presses upon us at this moment. If utterly deprived of it, we could no more hold discourse, and deprived of it we should be, if we admitted that there was no admixture of natures at all. Theaetetus. Very true. But I do not understand why at this moment we must determine the nature of discourse. Stranger. Perhaps you will see more clearly by the help of the following explanation. Theaetetus. What explanation? Stranger. Not being has been acknowledged by us to be one among many classes diffused over all being. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And thence arises the question whether not being mingles with opinion and language. Theaetetus. How so? Stranger. If not being has no part in the proposition, then all things must be true. But if not being has a part, then false opinion and false speech are possible. For to think or to say what is not is falsehood, which thus arises in the region of thought and in speech. Theaetetus. That is quite true. Stranger. And where there is falsehood, surely there must be deceit? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And if there is deceit, then all things must be full of idols and images and fancies? Theaetetus. To be sure. Stranger. Into that region the sophist, as we said, made his escape, and when he had got there, denied the very possibility of falsehood. No one, he argued, either conceived or uttered falsehood, inasmuch as not being did not in any way partake of being. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And now not being has been shown to partake of being, and therefore he will not continue fighting in this direction, but he will probably say that some ideas partake of not being, and some not, and that language and opinion are of the non-partaking class, and he will still fight to the death against the existence of the image-making and fantastic art, in which we have placed him, because, as he will say, opinion and language do not partake of not being. And unless this participation exists, there can be no such thing as falsehood. And with the view of meeting this evasion, we must begin by inquiring into the nature of language, opinion, and imagination, in order that when we find them we may find also that they have communion with not being, and, having made out the connection of them, may thus prove that falsehood exists. And therein we will imprison the sophist, if he deserves it, or if not, we will let him go again, and look for him in another class. Theaetetus. Certainly, stranger, there appears to be truth in what was said about the sophist at first, that he was of a class not easily caught. For he seems to have abundance of defences which he throws up, and which must every one of them be stormed before we can reach the man himself. And even now we have with difficulty got through his first defence, which is the not being of not being, and lo, here is another, for we have still to show that falsehood exists in the sphere of language and opinion, and there will be another and another line of defense without end. Stranger. Any one, Theaetetus, who is able to advance even a little ought to be of good cheer. For what would he who is dispirited at a little progress do, if he were making none at all, or even undergoing a repulse? Such a faint heart, as the proverb says, will never take a city. But now that we have succeeded thus far, the citadel is ours, and what remains is easier. Theaetetus. Very true. Stranger. Then, as I was saying, let us first of all obtain a conception of language and opinion, in order that we may have clearer grounds for determining whether not being has any concern with them, or whether they are both always true and neither of them ever false. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. Then now let us speak of names, as before we were speaking of ideas and letters, for that is the direction in which the answer may be expected. Theaetetus. And what is the question at issue about names? Stranger. The question at issue is whether all names may be connected with one another, or none, or only some of them. Theaetetus. Clearly the last is true. Stranger. I understand you to say that words which have a meaning when in sequence may be connected, but that words which have no meaning when in sequence cannot be connected. Theaetetus. What are you saying? Stranger. What I thought that you intended when you gave your assent, for there are two sorts of intimation of being which are given by the voice. Theaetetus. What are they? Stranger. One of them is called nouns, and the other verbs. Theaetetus. Describe them. Stranger. That which denotes action we call a verb. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And the other, which is an articulate mark set on those who do the actions, we call a noun. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. A succession of nouns only is not a sentence, any more than of verbs without nouns. Theaetetus. I do not understand you. Stranger. I see that when you gave your assent you had something else in your mind. But what I intended to say was, that a mere succession of nouns or of verbs is not discourse. Theaetetus. What do you mean? Stranger. I mean that words like walks, runs, sleeps, or any other words which denote action, however many of them you string together, do not make discourse. Theaetetus. How can they? Stranger. Or again, when you say lion, stag, horse, or any other words which denote agents, neither in this way of stringing words together do you attain to discourse, for there is no expression of action or inaction, or of the existence of existence or non-existence indicated by the sounds, until verbs are mingled with nouns. Then the words fit, and the smallest combination of them forms language, and is the simplest and least form of discourse. Theaetetus. Again I ask, what do you mean? Stranger. When any one says, a man learns, should you not call this the simplest and least of sentences? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. Yes, For he now arrives at the point of giving an intimation about something which is, or is becoming, or has become, or will be. And he not only names, but he does something by connecting verbs with nouns, and therefore we say that he discourses, and to this connection of words we give the name of discourse. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And as there are some things which fit one another, and other things which do not fit, so there are some vocal signs which do, and others which do not combine and form discourse. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. There is another small matter. Theaetetus. What is it? Stranger. A sentence must and cannot help having a subject. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And must be of a certain quality. Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. And now let us mind what we are about. Theaetetus. We must do so. Stranger. I will repeat a sentence to you in which a thing and an action are combined by the help of a noun and a verb, and you shall tell me of whom the sentence speaks. Theaetetus. I will, to the best of my power. Stranger. Theaetetus sits. Not a very long sentence. Theaetetus. Not very. Stranger. Of whom does the sentence speak, and who is the subject? That is what you have to tell. Theaetetus. Of me. I am the subject. Stranger. Or this sentence again. Theaetetus. What sentence? Stranger. Theaetetus, with whom I am now speaking, is flying. Theaetetus. That also is a sentence which will be admitted by every one to speak of me, and to apply to me. Stranger. We agreed that every sentence must necessarily have a certain quality. Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And what is the quality of each of these two sentences? Theaetetus. The one, as I imagine, is false, and the other true. Stranger. The true says what is true about you? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And the false says what is other than true? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And therefore speaks of things which are not as if they were? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And says that things are real of you which are not. For, as we were saying, in regard to each thing or person, there is much that is and much that is not? Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. The second of the two sentences which related to you was first of all an example of the shortest form consistent with our definition? Theaetetus. Yes, this was implied in our recent admission. Stranger. And in the second place it related to a subject? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. Who must be you, and can be nobody else? Theaetetus. Unquestionably. Stranger. And it would be no sentence at all if there were no subject. For, as we proved, a sentence which has no subject is impossible. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. When other, then, is asserted of you as the same, and not being as being, such a combination of nouns and verbs is really and truly false discourse? Theaetetus. Most true. Stranger. And therefore thought, opinion, and imagination are now proved to exist in our minds both as true and false? Theaetetus. How so? Stranger. You will know better if you first gain a knowledge of what they are, and in what they severally differ from one another. Theaetetus. Give me the knowledge which you would wish me to gain. Stranger. Are not thought and speech the same, with this exception, that what is called thought is the unuttered conversation of the soul with herself? Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. But the stream of thought which flows through the lips and is audible is called speech? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And we know that there exists in speech. Theaetetus. What exists? Stranger. Affirmation. Theaetetus. Yes, we know it. Stranger. When the affirmation or denial takes place in silence and in the mind only, have you any other name by which to call it but opinion? Theaetetus. There can be no other name. Stranger. And when opinion is presented, not simply, but in some form of sense, would you not call it imagination? Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. and seeing that language is true and false, and that thought is the conversation of the soul with herself, and opinion is the end of thinking, and imagination or fantasy is the union of sense and opinion, the inference is that some of them, since they are akin to language, should have an element of falsehood as well as of truth? Theaetetus. Certainly. Stranger. Do you perceive then that false opinion and speech have been discovered sooner than we expected? For just now we seem to be undertaking a task which would never be accomplished. Theaetetus. I perceive. Stranger. Then let us not be discouraged about the future, but now, having made this discovery, let us go back to our previous classification. Theaetetus. What classification? Stranger. We divided image-making into two sorts, the one likeness-making, the other imaginative or fantastic. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And we said that we were uncertain in which we should place the sophist? Theaetetus. We did say so. Stranger. And our heads began to go round more and more when it was asserted that there is no such thing as an image or idol or appearance, because in no manner or time or place can there ever be such a thing as falsehood? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. And now, since there has been shown to be false speech and false opinion, there may be imitations of real existences, and out of this condition of the mind an art of deception may arise? Theaetetus. Quite possible. Stranger. And we have already admitted, in what preceded, that the sophist was lurking in one of the divisions of the likeness-making art? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. Let us then renew the attempt, and in dividing any class always take the part to the right, holding fast to that which holds the sophist, until we have stripped him of all his common properties, and reached his difference or peculiar. Then we may exhibit him in his true nature, first to ourselves, and then to kindred dialectical spirits. Theaetetus. Very good. Stranger. You may remember that all art was originally divided by us into creative and acquisitive? Theaetetus. Yes. Stranger. And the sophist was flitting before us in the acquisitive class, in the subdivisions of hunting, contests, merchandise, and the like? Theaetetus. Very true. Stranger. But now that the imitative art has enclosed him, it is clear that we must begin by dividing the art of creation, for imitation is a kind of creation, of images, however, as we affirm, and not of real things. Theaetetus. Quite true. Stranger. In the first place there are two kinds of creation. Theaetetus. What are they? Stranger. One of them is human, and the other divine. Theaetetus. I do not follow. Stranger. Every power, as you may remember our saying originally, which causes things to exist, not previously existing, was defined by us as creative? Theaetetus. I remember. Stranger. Looking now at the world, and all the animals and plants, at things which grow upon the earth from seeds and roots, as well as at inanimate substances which are formed within the earth, fusal or non-fusal, shall we say that they come into existence, not having existed previously, by the creation of God, or shall we agree with vulgar opinion about them? Theaetetus. What is it? Stranger. The opinion that nature brings them into being from some spontaneous and unintelligent cause. Or shall we say that they are created by a divine reason and a knowledge which comes from God? Theaetetus. I dare say that, owing to my youth, I may often waver in my view, but now, when I look at you, and see that you incline to refer them to God, I defer to your authority. Stranger. Nobly said, Theaetetus. And if I thought that you were one of those who would hereafter change your mind, I would have gently argued with you, and forced you to assent. But as I perceive that you will come of yourself, and without any argument of mine, to that belief which, as you say, attracts you, I will not forestall the work of time. Let me suppose, then, that things which are said to be made by nature are the work of divine art, and that things which are made by man out of these are works of human art, and so there are two kinds of making and production, the one human and the other divine. Theaetetus. True. Stranger. Then now subdivide each of the two sections which we have already. Theaetetus. How do you mean? Stranger, I mean to say that you should make a vertical division of production or invention, as you have already made a lateral one. Theaetetus, I have done so. Stranger, then now there are in all 4 parts or segments. 2 of them have reference to us and are human, and 2 of them have reference to the gods and are divine. Theaetetus, true. Stranger, and again in the division which was supposed to be made in the other way, 1 part in each subdivision is the making of the things themselves, but the 2 remaining parts may be called the making of likenesses, and so the productive art is again divided into 2 parts. Theaetetus, tell me the divisions once more. Stranger, I suppose that we, and the other animals, and the elements out of which things are made, fire, water, and the like, are known by us to be each and all the creation and work of God. Theaetetus, true. Stranger, and there are images of them which are not them, but which correspond to them, and these are also the creation of a wonderful skill. Theaetetus, what are they? Stranger, the appearances which spring up of themselves in sleep or by day, such as a shadow when darkness arises in a fire, or the reflection which is produced when the light is bright and smooth objects meet on their surface with an external light, and creates a perception the opposite of our ordinary sight. Theaetetus, yes, and the images as well as the creation are equally the work of a divine hand. Stranger, and what shall we say of human art? Do we not make one house by the art of building, and another by the art of drawing, which is a sort of dream created by man for those who are awake? Theaetetus, quite true. Stranger, and other products of human creation are also twofold, and go in pairs. There is the thing with which the art of making the thing is concerned, and the image with which imitation is concerned. Theaetetus, now I begin to understand, and am ready to acknowledge that there are 2 kinds of production, and each of them twofold. In the lateral division there is both a divine and a human production. In the vertical there are realities, and a creation of a kind of similitudes. Stranger, and let us not forget that of the imitative class the one part was to have been likeness making, and the other fantastic, if it could be shown that falsehood is a reality and belongs to the class of real being. Theaetetus, yes. Stranger, and this appeared to be the case, and therefore now without hesitation we shall number the different kinds as 2. Theaetetus, true. Stranger, then now let us again divide the fantastic art. Theaetetus, where shall we make the division? Stranger, there is one kind which is produced by an instrument, and another in which the creator of the appearance is himself the instrument. Theaetetus, what do you mean? Stranger, when any one makes himself appear like another in his figure or his voice, imitation is the name for this part of the fantastic art. Theaetetus, yes. Stranger, let this then be named the art of mimicry, and this the province assigned to it. As for the other division, we are weary, and will give that up, leaving to some one else the duty of making the class and giving it a suitable name. Theaetetus, let us do as you say, assign a sphere to the one, and leave the other. Stranger, there is a further distinction, Theaetetus, which is worthy of our consideration, and for a reason which I will tell you. Theaetetus, let me hear. Stranger, there are some who imitate, knowing what they imitate, and some who do not know. And what line of distinction can there possibly be greater than that which divides ignorance from knowledge? Theaetetus, there can be no greater. Stranger, was not the sort of imitation of which we spoke just now the imitation of those who know? For he who would imitate you would surely know you, and your figure? Theaetetus, naturally. Stranger, and what would you say of the figure or form of justice, or of virtue in general? Are we not well aware that many, having no knowledge of either, but only a sort of opinion, do their best to show that this opinion is really entertained by them, by expressing it, as far as they can, in word and deed? Theaetetus, yes, that is very common. Stranger, and do they always fail in their attempt to be thought just when they are not, or is not the very opposite true? Theaetetus, The very opposite. Stranger. Such a one then should be described as an imitator, to be distinguished from the other, as he who is ignorant is distinguished from him who knows? Theaetetus. True. Stranger. Can we find a suitable name for each of them? This is clearly not an easy task, for among the ancients there was some confusion of ideas, which prevented them from attempting to divide genera into species, wherefore there is no great abundance of names. Yet for the sake of distinctness I will make bold to call the imitation which coexists with opinion the imitation of appearance; that which coexists with science a scientific or learned imitation. Theaetetus. Granted. Stranger. The former is our present concern, for the sophist was classed with imitators indeed, but not among those who have knowledge? Theaetetus. Very true. Stranger. Let us then examine our imitator of appearance, and see whether he is sound, like a piece of iron, or whether there is still some crack in him. Theaetetus. Let us examine him. Stranger. Indeed, there is a very considerable crack. For if you look, you find that one of the two classes of imitators is a simple creature, who thinks that he knows that which he only fancies; the other sort has knocked about among arguments, until he suspects and fears that he is ignorant of that which to the many he pretends to know. Theaetetus. There are certainly the two kinds which you describe. Stranger. Shall we regard one as the simple imitator, the other as the dissembling or ironical imitator? Theaetetus. Very good. Stranger. And shall we further speak of this latter class as having one or two divisions? Theaetetus. Answer yourself. Stranger. Upon consideration, then, there appear to me to be two. There is the dissembler who harangues a multitude in public in a long speech, and the dissembler who in private and in short speeches compels the person who is conversing with him to contradict himself. Theaetetus. What you say is most true. Stranger. And who is the maker of the longer speeches? Is he the statesman or the popular orator? Theaetetus. The latter. Stranger. And what shall we call the other? Is he the philosopher or the sophist? Theaetetus. The philosopher he cannot be, for upon our view he is ignorant; but since he is an imitator of the wise, he will have a name which is formed by an adaptation of the word, sophos. What shall we name him? I am pretty sure that I cannot be mistaken in terming him the true and very sophist. Stranger. Shall we bind up his name as we did before, making a chain from one end of his genealogy to the other? Theaetetus. By all means. Stranger. He then who traces the pedigree of his art as follows, who, belonging to the conscious or dissembling section of the art of causing self-contradiction, is an imitator of appearance, and is separated from the class of fantastic, which is a branch of image-making, into that further division of creation, the juggling of words, a creation human, and not divine. Any one who affirms the real sophist to be of this blood and lineage will say the very truth. Theaetetus. Undoubtedly. And of Sophist by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett, read by Geoffrey Edwards, metacoordinated by Bart Delieu, proof listened by Rapunzelina. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.